Welcome back to another in-depth from OpenTEAM, or OpenTEAM, the Open Technology Ecosystem for Agricultural Management. We're a project of Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and the Environment. And our dynamic growing community consists of over 35 organizations. Many of you are part of that, and over 200 individuals who are active every month in various working groups and OpenTEAM related meetings. Our in-depth learning series helps build the knowledge base of the OpenTEAM community in a way that fosters coherence and collaboration, and each in-depth helps us to collaboratively evaluate new concepts and technologies in an effort to ask better questions and to build better tools through sharing our work. We seek to address common barriers rather than promote any specific solution. In the pre-competitive space that we hold, we bring together public and private partners to achieve better outcomes and accelerate innovation by sharing across boundaries. So today we have with us Revathi Kollegala. She's the executive director of the Regen Foundation, newly hired in that role. And she's going to introduce us to the work of the foundation, which I'm excited to dive in, especially as it relates to OpenTEAM and the next few years, and our work around creating a governance system and structure that can really be supported through community, and community can be participants in that governance structure. So Revathi, I'll hand it over to you to take it from here. We'll have about maybe 20 or 30 minutes of presentation, and then would love to open it up for dialogue and questions and answers. So thank you again, Ray, for being here.
Perfect. Thanks, Laura. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Revathi. I also go by Rave, and I have a couple of slides for just ease of talking through them. But before that, I'm gonna maybe briefly introduce myself. Like Laura mentioned, I'm here wearing the hat of the executive director of Regen Foundation. And I'll go a little bit more into what that means a little bit later, and please bear with me if this is something you've heard before and you're familiar with the work of Regen Network, as a lot of you may be. I also see Christian is on the call, who's one of our thought leaders and co-founders of the entire ecosystem, Christian. So bear with me if that's a lot of repetition. But before I go into that, I want to talk a little bit about sort of where I come from and my background. I am right now speaking from rural India, and amongst the other hats I wore before Regen Foundation is also working with a women's agricultural cooperative here in India, which consists mainly of women in informal economy. And before that, I've been an environmental activist and a technologist for almost a decade in the US. But I came back here to continue my work for various reasons, primarily being that the sort of the spirit of community you find at the crossroads here, including in some of these women's cooperatives, is really very deeply embedded in the culture, and it's commons-based. And that kind of governance is often not seen in technology systems. So part of what I look at is bridging that gap. And the second thing is that, on the other hand, technology and a lot of these, the digital gap also leaves a lot of these folks behind in the developed world. And also there's a disparity between global South and global North. And the work of the foundation sort of touches upon some of these. And with that, maybe let me share the screen and see how that works. Hopefully you can all see that. So I'm going to talk about especially our vision for community governance here. And the disclaimer here is that this is absolutely the focus of the work of the foundation and the organization right now. And it's also something that's evolving and developmental as we speak. So I am here really to learn from the OpenTEAM community as well and make this be a two-way dialogue. So one of the things to talk about here as we talk about community governance and where the foundation fits in the ecosystem is to understand Regen Network. Regen Network sort of bridges the need for ecological investment into regeneration, and it's between people who would want to invest in ecosystem credit and who value regeneration, and people who actually do that, land stewards, farmers, the kind of folks that are in the OpenTEAM community, right? Now that, and the medium of exchange are Regen tokens, which are blockchain based. This technology around it, it's built on Cosmos SDK, and it has particular quirks to it. But also, as this system was envisioned, the foundation was created along with Regen Network, which plays this stewards the technology side of it and everything else associated with it. The foundation was created to steward the community that's inadvertently formed when people buy these tokens. So whether they want to or not, they end up forming a community. And those who have these tokens from various parts of the world, like they decide on what happens to the Regen ledger, which is the entity with the tokens. What is the future of how the tokens are going to increase in value, and what people do with all those tokens? How does the community stay aligned with the vision and values? And the foundation is essentially part of this community, and about 30% of the tokens the foundation kind of stewards to help account for these gaps that are there on the screen right now in terms of ecological equity and digital inclusion. So the understanding is, a lot of people who we want as part of the Regen ecosystem to be involved in this process of setting the vision for the community, the Regen token holder community, the Regen ledger community. They may not have the resources to buy the tokens and invest initially, or they may not have the technological know-how. And there are a bunch of those groups, right? And what this means is they will not be able to have a seat at the table. They'll not be able to vote. They may not be able to participate in some of the rewards and the benefits that come from it. So the foundation was created to bridge all of that, and essentially of the entire, and these tokens are really digital representations of a vote, right? And 30% of them are kept aside to distribute to these groups that we think need to be represented. And some of these groups you see that we've identified are these, and it's not limited to them. I mean, the most obvious group that you can think of are land stewards, right? Like farmers, and, farming communities, the ranchers that you're all familiar with. Landscapes are also something we're thinking about, and this is sort of like a particular look at the rights of nature, if you're all familiar with it, where, in Ecuador, for instance, it's legal for natural ecosystems and entities to have their own legal entities, sort of. So it's possible that nobody owns them as a property, but indigenous communities often steward them, and they help, keep them in the flourishing state that they are, like a lot of the Amazonian forests. So those landscapes also, we think, and the communities who steward them could be part of these groups. Scientists, of course, climate scientists, conservation biologists, people that we can learn from and which the community needs to learn from in order to be really focused and true to its spirit of building a regenerative world, right? And ecosystems across the world, and developers. So primarily Regen Network does run and develop the technology that facilitates this exchange. So on top of that, you can build other applications which can support the same spirit. And examples could be, for instance, you could derive more insights or value out of the data, or use Regen tokens in a different manner, or even develop applications for more governance, for instance, where you decide what to do with the token, or how you might associate grants with the tokens, and so on and so forth. And what I want you all to take away from this is, when I say token, I'm very aware that it's a very techie term that I'm using here. But in this context of where the communities are allocated tokens from the foundation, it is for governance. It is for co-ownership of the community, and to have a seat at the table where they can participate in strategic decisions. And this can include a variety of things, from really operational things to something that's more long-term and strategic, and where you can think about, hey, will this really be helpful in creating a regenerative system? What are the market mechanisms around it? Things like that. And the other thing is also that these tokens, by the nature of the network they are in, that with time, they accrue rewards. So, and there's a technical term called, you would stake your token, which is the token is part of the network, and it is in use. And when that happens with time, there is an inflation mechanism put in place where you earn rewards. So the communities who would be identified by Regen Foundation and included as part of governance would also be given these tokens that earn rewards, and you refer to them as staking rewards. And I'm saying all of this, of course, with a really vested interest that potentially we would love for folks in the OpenTEAM community to be a part of it, right? But I also understand that it's an abstract concept somewhere flying in the air above and up there in the clouds. So, so if I were to dream with you a little bit, on what this might look like. The pic that you see on the screen, this is one of the Indian villages, and a lot of the villages and the villagers will use pull-up carts like this, of course, for transport, but also for tilling and whatnot. These are the kind of agricultural communities that I worked with as part of the women's cooperative I was telling you about. So if we were to imagine them being one of these communities, what it would look like is there are two levels of governance here. One is, of course, inputs to the ledger, which is the ledger is the larger region community with the tokens, and that includes the other 70% of the tokens. That might be validators, people who run the hardware and the computer nodes that keeps the system running, and people who have paid in to buy the tokens, and any other members of the community. That includes Regen Network itself and the Regen Foundation itself. And that's one level of decision, right? So you might have decisions there like, hey, do we keep the tokens increasing in value? And what are the different ways in which you can exchange tokens with each other, or so on and so forth? Or, hey, would we want to create a community fund that would fund some sort of a project that aligns with our values? And do you support that? These kinds of decisions are what you would see in the ledger. And so a woman in a village like this in rural India essentially would also be giving inputs to the ledger. But that would essentially mean that there is a digital intermediary, right? Like a lot of these folks have local community leaders, and some of them may have more comfort with technology. So they might use their smartphone to have local governance, whether that's in-person polls or whatnot, and or even WhatsApp, where they can give their inputs to the local person nearby, and they would give their inputs to the ledger via an interface that right now requires a little bit more technical know-how to operate. And the converse is also true. So from the ledger, when the tokens accrue rewards, these are essentially more digital tokens. So there is a question, and so these digital tokens will also be distributed to the digital intermediaries or the organization that they're a part of. So then locally, there's also this question of how can the woman in rural India benefit from these rewards, converting them into meaningful value. With some of the indigenous communities, we're exploring sort of converting them into community currencies, for example. So those are the kinds of questions to think about when you look at how this might work in practice. And so essentially that means that what the foundation does is we really want to include all of these stakeholder groups to give them tokens. That comes with governance benefits, it comes with rewards, and it implies these responsibilities, which is you have to look at how they're used. You also have to look at, hey, these are essentially digital assets, digital artifacts. So in order to hold on to them, the way it works in the ecosystem is there are validators, which is they run hardware and they take care of some of the technical aspects of making sure that these tokens are in circulation and that they're growing over time and whatnot. And usually someone that owns a token would it's called delegating. They would delegate that to a validator, and the validator would do a lot of the technical stuff on their behalf. And that will mean that it incurs some transaction fees. But some folks do choose to be their own validator, but that comes with setting up hardware, and it requires some technical know-how. However, we do think that for some of these communities, it might be beneficial to become a validator. So there is a question on whether, the community collectively wants to be a validator. And the bigger the community, the more tokens they will have, which means the more rewards they'll get. So there is a question on how big a community is it. If it is, for instance, the Amazon indigenous tribe may be 1,000-person community, and you could also have a science research organization with 15 scientists. And so we're trying to sort of have a general sort of distribution along which, depending on the number of people who are in the community, the number of tokens that the organization gets is just grows proportionally. So they would also get more rewards. And the community has to figure out how they want to use the rewards, right? And this is specific to how they would use it and how they would decide on how they would use it. For instance, if everything goes into a grant pool for the community, how will you decide, hey, who gets the grant? How do we distribute it? Or do we have different hubs, and do they all get distributed equally? And especially with Dawn, we've been, thinking about the different kinds of tools that would work for similar communities, and in the OpenTEAM context too. For instance, can we outfit Hilo to work with this for folks to be able to vote on it, and to have discrete hubs and sub-communities who can vote on these things and determine how these rewards are used and converted to something that's meaningful. So essentially, that I'm leaving you with a lot more questions than answers and saying, this is what we have thought of, and we would love to involve the open team. But also I realize there's a lot of gap between where we are and maybe what you know so far. I will myself be will have an orientation with Laura to the OpenTEAM community, but I'm very open and eager to answer any questions you may have and work with you maybe more in depth over time for any more questions. And I'm just figuring this out together.
Great. Thank you so much, Revathi. That was a good introduction, and I'm sure there are many questions. I'm giving folks a little bit of time. You can either raise your hand or just take yourself off mute and jump right in. In the meantime, I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about the process that you imagine for organizing the community staking DAOs, or even describe sort of what that means, that term, in terms of the governance, and how you see that unfolding.
I'm sure. I completely skipped over the terms, so it's not because I'm aware I'm using a lot of jargon as it is. So essentially, for these communities that I mentioned, we're referring to them as community staking DAOs, and the process of giving them tokens as the endowment process. And DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization, which is just to say that these are people who come together on account of holding the token. Otherwise, they're autonomous, they don't know each other, and are distributed in various ways and are not centralized. It's not particularly organized. Usually, in this case, that might be slightly different, right? But what that would mean is we would look at OpenTEAM to have certain number of these digital tokens, but it would be OpenTEAM as a community. So beyond that, there is one very near-term essential question of would OpenTEAM want to have some technological support and handle all these tokens themselves, like become their own validator? And if so, the foundation would be absolutely happy to support. And the second question also is for members in the community to be able to play with these tokens or the rewards. How do people work with each other right now, and what are the tools that are needed? What are the processes that are needed? And that as well, I'm very aware that there might be a gap, and I am all eager to learn about it and see how we can support bridging the gap.
Great. It looks like Keith has a question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a couple of things. Yeah, I'd wondered on the blockchain sort of credits, and thinking in terms of rewards for environmental services. I mean, would this be purely a cash benefit? I mean, we have dealt with other types of rewards, like providing additional advisory services to communities or soil conservation services, rather than giving out sort of cash to farmers. I just wondered, how that might work. And the other point was, you put a lot of emphasis in the paper on, I just sort of quickly scanned it, on soil carbon. I wondered if you considered a wider range of soil health benefits, like nutrient water retention capacity, for example, rather than only focusing on soil carbon as the metric. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Keith. I'll take an initial attempt at answering your questions, but some of them, fortunately on this call, we also have Gregory and Christian, who happen to be experts and the visionaries on exactly that, and when the network was created. So what we're envisioning right now, just for the purpose of the community staking DAOs, is the tokens, which are essentially the equivalent of digital money given to farmers directly. But that's not to say that in the future, in the ecosystem or the foundation or whatnot, there couldn't be other sorts of benefits that come from it. But for the sake of just these, this initiative by the foundation that it's focusing on right now, those are digital tokens, which, and this is a conversation to be had on if it's converted, like, would it be cash? What would it look like in an analog form? And maybe to expand on that more, and also the second part of your question, I'm gonna pass the baton on to Gregory or Christian, whoever wants to pick it up.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thanks, Revathi. Happy to chat about that a little bit, Keith. So, I mean, I think there's a couple of layers. As Revathi mentioned, the foundation's role in inviting communities, land stewards, and others into the governance of the network, and the way in which they can receive rewards is complementary to, but not the same as the functionality of two parties agreeing upon an outcome and getting paid for it. And so that process, you can use, you know, kind of whatever currency you want. And yeah, you could create agreements about other soil health attributes beyond carbon. We've focused out of practicality on carbon because that is a rapidly expanding marketplace and there's lots of demand. But I sort of wholeheartedly and am in heated agreement that there's perhaps even more important things to be valuing. And that's all functionality that we're excited to support, and types of agreements that I think are important. And yeah, so hopefully that kind of answers that.
Yeah, exciting stuff. Yeah.
Great. I had a question. Oh, we've got Crystal's got a question.
Hi, thanks. Maybe I missed it, but I'm curious, how is the regenerative practices being quantified? Like, how is there something in place for assessing the baseline and then determining that there have been improvements? Or is it just owner reports?
I can speak to that again if you'd like, and Dr. Chisel Buhlman could speak to that as well in some specific contexts. So at a large pattern level, you know, and these are sort of questions about, I think, Regen Network. So hi, I'm Gregory. I'm the CEO of R&D Incorporated, which is a sister to Regen Foundation. And we've been doing some of the technology building while the foundation is doing some of the community building. So the large context is, you know, kind of the same answer I gave to Keith. What do people need to make an agreement about at a pattern level, and how do we monitor and quantify and verify that the outcome that's being agreed upon is actually taking place? So in the case of soil carbon, there are, I think, some decent standards out there around how you do monitoring, reporting, and verification, as far as sort of baselining, answering questions about additionality, answering questions about permanence and leakage, and assembling the data set that sort of shows that and allows for the issuance of credits. So in terms of the market function at this moment, yeah, assembling a carbon claim on Regen Network looks fairly similar to assembling a carbon claim on other platforms. However, we're building a sort of a larger infrastructure that we hope allows people to make different types of ecological agreements, in which, for instance, soil health, maybe there is a self-reported, like a lower cost self-reported type of agreement that a municipality is entering into with their farmers that enables them to lower downstream flood risk and nutrient runoff, and they're not so concerned with a rigorous quantification of carbon for a voluntary or compliance carbon market. So we're sort of starting, R&D Inc. is kind of focused right now on this question about generating high quality carbon credits, but at an infrastructure level and as a community, we're really wanting very low cost, highly usable tools for people to make agreements about ecological state. And again, the role of the foundation there is to ensure that communities around the world are being represented in the process and the governance so that campesino farmers in Latin America and women's cooperatives in India and other places where there is not necessarily representation in this conversation can participate in saying, hey, these are the types of agreements and services that we think are important and that we would like to start to bring to the market, right? And so the foundation is serving that role to sort of build community and bridge that divide so that it isn't just sort of a top-down carbon market that emerges here.
Okay, so am I correct then that it's less like an individual farm-based concept than more of a community or association that would be looking at sort of bigger changes amongst their memberships? Is that, like, it's not just for an individual farmer to use this program?
So for the community staking DAOs, I think you're absolutely right. I think the way that we're conceptualizing people coming together to engage is more of an association or a cooperation or a regional initiative than an individual farmer. It could be a collection of individual farmers, right, that sort of bands together and say, hey, we'd like to participate in, you know, in this kind of program. As far as the payment for ecosystem services and sort of qualification for a carbon credit, again, these are sort of two separate but complementary lines of progress happening in the larger Regen Network world. That can be an individual farmer, right? You could have a farm that is going through a process to issue carbon credits to a buyer. And that can be independent or deeply complemented by participating in the governance of the network.
Okay, that makes way more sense. Thank you.
I don't see any other questions, but based on this,
I was on mute, but go ahead.
Oh.
Well, I'll jump in with my question if that's all right. So we've had a lot of conversations around, you mentioned the term digital intermediary, and we've been having a lot of conversations, again, not only about that digital intermediary and sort of bridging some of the cultural gaps with the use of technology, but also around the role that Gregory just mentioned, fiduciary responsibilities of aggregating some of the responsibility and stewardship of those within the community. I wonder if you might just speak, you know, maybe Revathi, and then certainly to the whole Regen Network as well, but you in particular about your experience and work in that area and any observations you have, because again, I think that's something that you know, it's not unique to the digital world. I mean, I think there's a general nervousness around the digitization of you know, there's clearly these benefits on the one side and efficiency and low cost potentially, and also you know, we talk a lot about trust. What are the challenges of how do we bridge that that lack of trust because of some of those technical or social barriers?
Thanks, Ryan. That's a really important question, and it really touches sort of, I think, one of the main focus areas that we're talking about in terms of the digital divide and really making sure that we have digital equity. I can speak to it in terms of two different scenarios, right, that I'm familiar with. One of which is India, where I'm at, and where social fabric is such that, you know, people know each other from several years. They're in small villages in the context that I'm talking about. So the trust is formed by really, you know, you meet the other person face to face, and in pandemic, mask to mask, during, or, and it's really through this interpersonal relationship that you kind of trust that where the rate of literacy is less than 60%, and what it takes for someone to be literate is to literally be able to sign. So less than 60% of the people in India are able to, you know, sign. Otherwise, we just do a fingerprint on most documents. So when you have such a low rate of literacy, you depend on other people who are more literate than you as an intermediary for most tasks. And that's especially true when it comes to accessing technology or things like that. So usually what happens is you have these digital version of most software or ecosystems where they have a few representatives and so on in every village. And the way the market works is that folks are incentivized to be more helpful to the folks and help bring them onto the system. And it works that way. Or these are community leaders and people that you've gone to do your accounts, for instance, over the years. And that way the trust is built. The women's cooperative I work with works with the latter, which is first you identify community leaders who already exist. And if they don't have the rates of literacy or digital literacy required, identify others who can help that, and then help those leaders teach others and onboard the others in the community. The second scenario that I want to talk about is sort of more in France and Germany and these kinds of Western European countries. It was started here as a community called WeShare, and it's a decentralized community of freelancers. And so the way it works there is they also have country-based nodes. So you have WeShare Canada, for instance, or WeShare Spain, who are sort of partly autonomous. But what they all share in common is they have literally the software tool where everybody pulls in money, and then in that you can go and propose projects, and from your pool of money, everybody can, depending on whether or not they align with it, they'll click a button and enter a number, and they say that's the number of dollars that they, or euros that they want to contribute to that project. Even their annual operations across the globe, like for all these nodes, is funded through this kind of voting, right? And they have these mind maps and wikis and a whole sort of things that includes handbooks and all those things, which essentially are like self-service help desk. So that's what teaches you. You look at it and you read it, and that'll teach you, for instance, how to create a login to have your own wallet, to be able to vote, to send an invoice, to get paid, these kinds of things. And so there, the trust is built because it's a community that already exists. So it's sort of pure validation. In the first system that I talked about in India, there is a deliberate sort of system where you identify or you nominate community leaders or people who are more literate, who can help bridge sort of the last mile gap in digital literacy, so to speak. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. It's again, I think there's it's something that we've been talking a lot about, not just for transactions, but in terms of just even onboarding or accessing basic tools. I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about sort of how you envision, again, there's the reward process, but, you know, maybe walk through a little bit of how that translates into action on the ground. And so from a reward token into, say, a community grant making program or supporting. And I think this is sort of getting at some of the sort of maybe unspoken, but like this is an approach in some ways to fund some of the commons, right? Is that, and that there's and again, there's I think another piece here that they're on the other transactions. So we said there's no transaction costs, but there's transaction costs elsewhere, right? And so that's part of what's funding the underlying infrastructure. So maybe just, you know, a little bit about sort of that process or even motivation of how around funding the commons, and how that you know, again, how and why that voting is so important.
So John, like, just to clarify, are you asking about sort of funding the commons for the region ledger, or in terms of
well it's a bit of both, right? So there's
DAOs,
yeah, so it's actually a little bit, the question's a little bit of a both, because you're living in both worlds. It's both environmental commons, but then there's a digital commons that also needs to, you know, to support the transactions for everybody, needs to exist as well. So maybe a bit, and then this could be to the whole Regen team as well, if you.
I can speak to part of the question, which is, and then I'm going to leave it open to Gregory and Christian on the larger Regen ledger commons, because that is a digital commons. It's a community that comes together because primarily people have these digital tokens. But I'm going to talk about a little bit on if there was a community of farmers or a community like OpenTEAM community, which gets a bunch of tokens, let's say, that's just for them to divide the rewards and whatnot. Then also, how do you go about it? So then as well, just the mechanism of receiving these tokens, the rewards that are associated with them, and how you distribute them. That in itself is also going to be sort of a digital commons, and it has to work very well together with what are already sort of shared resources and shared activities that the community does. For instance, in OpenTEAM, if there are common community projects or operations costs and things like that, that is common to all of the community. A lot of ways that I've seen is these sort of common grants and common rewards can go to some of those, to subsidize some of those. But essentially this, and like I was giving you the example of VShare, people vote on it and they sort of opt in to subsidize all of these from their individual pools, the shared resources. But that is a decision that sort of the community needs to take and sort of put the processes on and keep that going. And I'm gonna, I don't know, pass on the baton to Gregory or Christian in terms of if you want to speak to maybe the ledger as a commons and where the validators come in, and in terms of the transaction costs and such.
Sure. So Regen Ledger is a public blockchain, and it is governed by token holders. And I'll just start at square one and then go. And Doran, if you'd like to adjust what I'm speaking about, just feel free to interrupt me. So it's a public ledger governed by token holders, which means that if you have a token, you can permissionlessly interact with the functionality of the blockchain. And that blockchain is sort of has attributes that mean that all of the data on the blockchain is always available to anyone. So it creates this public good of data integrity and availability. And that's one of the base layer elements that I think we and many people believe is important for infrastructure for doing ecological claims, accounting assets, and governance of those assets, right? It sets up a situation where all stakeholders have equal access to the same information, right? Which is sort of one of the fundamental pillars that we're shooting for, is how do we create a situation where all of the stakeholders have equal access to information, because information asymmetry, that is to say, if a farmer in India has much less information than a big corporate that's buying goods from them, that creates challenges. It creates distortions in power. And in this case, this is sort of essential, right? If we're going to have climate action centered around repairing and regenerating our agroecosystems, we must have information parity and access between all of the stakeholders, between governments and a smallholder farmer and a big corporation. We sort of need a place where we have information symmetry there. So that's a public good that's being generated by a public blockchain, right? And that public blockchain is governed by anyone who would like to have access to those tokens and, govern at the protocol level what is able to take place on that blockchain. So I'm speaking from the lens right now of a sort of like the public goods from economic theory, and a public blockchain from blockchain theory. All of those things in my mind are sort of similes or similar to a commons, right? And if we think about Elinor Ostrom's work defining what a commons is, essentially, and the essence of that is that you have a clear boundary around who is able to access and govern a shared resource, right? And in this case, that boundary is there's a public blockchain, and token holders are able to govern it. They're able to write to it, but anyone in the world is able to read from it. So it's fully transparent, right? And so that is the sort of relationship that is established. So a transparent ecological ledger is the service that this commons is providing out into the marketplace, essentially. So hopefully that's helpful. Just sort of 101, kind of like framing the language here. Laura, I see you have your hand up. Maybe you can help guide this.
Yeah. I just wanted to follow up with one question to you, Gregory, as well. When you say everything will be on a public ledger, what type of information would be included, particularly around personally identifiable information on a farm level, and ecological information as well that's maybe attached to that? So
let's also, so there's an extra layer of complexity here. That's a great question. So all of this is relying on some really amazing open source cryptography technology. So just because everyone can see that there's a hash or a transaction on the blockchain does not necessarily mean that they can see what the specific data is. So there's sort of so you can assign essentially the ability for certain people to decrypt what's taking place there, and other people not, and you can match hashes. So you can check if the same data is there, if the same data has been without knowing what the data is. So it allows us to generate different forms of trust and interactions as is situationally appropriate. So this isn't a theory that, like everybody's personally identifiable information is publicly accessible and everybody knows everything about everybody. It's that we have a data integrity layer, which means that, if you put something up on the blockchain, you can't change it.
Yep, that makes sense.
But you can put it up in a way that is not exposed and visible to other people, and you can give certain people the permission to see what that data is, or to just or anybody can check and say, you know, Laura put this hash up of a data set about her soil carbon, and she said it's in this place. And if the hashes match, people can just automatically check, yes, it is there. And this other person has permission to look at it, and they said that it matches. So you can create these web of trust relationships, which is what I refer to as an intersubjective verification. So there's sort of this process where people are contributing to a claim or the generation of knowledge in such a way as to create the right sort of relationships and incentives between all the parties to achieve the most optimal outcome.
Great.
Great. Thanks, Greg. I think we have Nejma and then Paul up. We're really just getting rolling here.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for this presentation, and Revathi. I'll start out by saying that I'm totally blockchain challenged. I think people have tried to explain it to me a couple times. But I was actually, my question is more around rights of nature and how the tokens from that 30% would be going towards rights of nature. So I guess my question is how, like, you know, when you all thought about this and how you would be able to distribute these tokens towards rights of nature, because we're working on something similar, but through an ecosystem services fund, essentially, right? And the point of it is, so were you thinking like to mitigate some of the harmful practices, or is it to support right? to support Indigenous-led initiatives for legal personhood, like collaborative frameworks or protected areas? Anyways, I just wanted, or, you know, like litigation or the legal aspect of rights of nature, you know, through environmental law, or all of the above. I just I'm trying to see how that would work. Yeah, thank you.
I can pick that up, at least give a shot at the beginning of an answer. So Nejma, that's an excellent question, and I would love to know more if you can get in touch on what work you do in terms of the rights of nature and which angle you're coming at. Whereas, I mean, ideally, perhaps all or most of the above that you mentioned, but right now, the conversations we are having are specifically, for instance, with Indigenous communities in Amazon who already have a very thriving and flourishing ecosystem, but sort of supporting them to just be and keep doing what they're doing to maintain it, essentially. At least that's the very concrete thing we're looking at. But the others are not. Nothing else is off the table, really.
And so I just want to ask, so the tokens are representing the support that the Regen Network, for example, and the other networks to support Indigenous folks that are, you know, maintaining ecosystems through the fundamental rights of nature. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Yeah.
Great.
Anything you'd add, Gregory?
Well, yeah, I'd say it's actually beyond that. It's making sure, for instance, that a landscape like Lake Erie that has a corporate personhood, and the trustees, the humans who are acting on behalf as fiduciaries of that landscape, have governance control over the fintech infrastructure that is going to be the foundation for financial and legal agreements about that place, right? So the theory here is that this is public infrastructure, and that, you know, landscapes, Indigenous peoples, land stewards, need to be clearly included in the governance of the public infrastructure, as well as supported with the sort of like, in this case, you know, the deal is, if you participate in securing and governing the infrastructure, you get block rewards, which is an asset which you could sell to fund your operations, or you could restake to build your asset. So there's a reciprocity there. So there's a sort of an inclusion in the ability to govern, and there's also an inclusion in the upside of participating in the network security and governance. And so it's sort of both. It's like, we want to be supporting these people so that they have access to assets and can participate with that, but also we feel that if we're not all part of governing the infrastructure, then how will we trust it? And that's sort of like the mistake that's been made currently with how the financial system works. And if we recapitulate that mistake out into the natural capital, in quotes, sort of industry that's about to boom, that we will end up, you know, sort of getting a bubble effect, because we won't be able to trust the very people who are stewarding the landscapes won't be able to trust the markets and the mechanisms that are meant to be rewarding them for their actions.
Great.
Yeah, that makes sense. It reminds me of what Dorn was talking about, actually, about the trust aspect. And so this is, yeah, that makes sense. I think we're almost out of time. So
We are at the top, which is great because we've got a bunch of questions we won't be able to get to. So folks who weren't able to ask their question, please be in touch. We'll get them to the team here. And we look forward to joining you for next week's or in 2 weeks with Jonathan Lundgren for the next in-depth. So thank you very much. And we'll see
Thanks,
you all
everyone.
again soon.
Thanks,
for having us.
Revathi.
Nice to meet you
So
all.
much.
Take care.
Thank you so much, Revathi.
Thank you.
thank you, everyone.
Bye.